As you know, we're here today to talk about the review of the officer-involved shootings that occurred last year. There were 18 officer-involved shootings. We passed out the report in the news release, so you can take a look at the synopsis of each of the incidents. But what we're going to focus on in our remarks today is the action items that are more at the end of the report. So the goal wasn't to rehash every single incident and debate it. We had press conferences for each one of those. We had separate investigations for each one of those. And as Chief will explain, we had this high-level group of deputy chiefs and others who went through all 18 incidents and came up with some ideas and some more recommendations as to what APD could do about it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chief Medina to say a few words, and then we'll go from there.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I think it's important that we look how we could always be better, and we've talked about this. When I took over as chief, we talked about investigations and how we had to be better, and we created a detective academy. And that detective academy, we see today how much more improved our homicide unit is and how we're getting results for families. I think that this was a big important step for the Albuquerque Police Department in the fact that we have to prepare for some day when the Department of Justice leaves the Albuquerque Police Department and how we're going to navigate through trends and situations. The process has brought us a force review board, which looks at each case individually, but the Albuquerque Police Department took this a step above what was required from our settlement agreement, and we looked at the cases and the trending as a whole. This was nothing that was brought by anybody other than the police department looking to see how we could do things better and how we could ensure that we're always staying in the forefront and we never get to a point where we were in the past. This is about continuing to improve and to see how we could do things better, how we could add technology, how we could add equipment, how we could train better. And we had a group sit down over several sessions, look at these incidents, and we've already made some changes that we've talked about. We revamped our use of force policy. I think that was a big key. There are other things that we've looked at in terms of our training and little things that have been implemented over the past 2 years that also will lead to some of the things that we see. So there are some things that have already been covered, but this is our commitment to, number one, be transparent and explain to the community where we're at in this process, and also to build that confidence that when we do have trends occur, that we'll always be proactive and look to see how we can make changes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Chief Lowe, who's going to explain the process and what they've come out with and where we want to look at in the future to hopefully work on reducing outcomes of officer-involved shootings and make ourselves a better, stronger department. Thank you.
Good morning. Again, I'm Deputy Chief Corey Lowe. I'm over the Accountability Bureau. And so I want to go ahead and explain a little bit of the review that we did for the 2022 18 officer-involved shootings. Some of the after-action items that we're going to consider, and keep in mind we really want to focus on doing full evaluations to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences by these decisions. So one of them is we want to increase training on hands-on or empty-handed techniques. We already train on these. These are the ones that we just want to do a little bit more frequently. So officers already are required to attend more than 80 hours of training, and supervisors more than 100 hours of training for 2023. So we want to evaluate options on how we can provide additional training, such as defensive tactics, such as additional hands-on training to our officers, where we also don't take them away from too much time from the field where they're answering calls for service or investigating crime. The second one is increased consideration of less lethal munitions. We did identify a few cases that where less lethal may have been used prior to the officer-involved shooting. That does not say that that would have remedied or avoided the officer-involved shooting overall. However, we wanted to put that into consideration. So we did identify this prior to this group conducting its review, and we started doing our revision of our use of force policy last year. It was a complete overhaul, and we focused on areas such as passive and active resistance and totality of circumstances, along as when they can use less lethal munition, making it more consistent. These revisions were published in January of 2023, and we are going to be training those starting in April, and they'll be going to 20 hours of classroom time and 20 hours of reality-based training. And in those reality-based training, we're using some of what we learned from this overview to be able to include in our scenarios, such as weapon identification, threat identification, and transitioning weapons, including transitioning from handgun to less lethal, or vice versa, or transitioning to no weapon at all, depending on the individual's actions. Another aspect that we're added is increased supervision. In several of the officer-involved shootings, there was critical situations that could have required or benefited from a supervisor on scene. The department overall is pretty good at having supervisors on scene for critical incidents anyway, but what we wanted to do is revise our policies that will include types of calls for service that requiring a supervisory response, as well as a call for service that would normally not have a supervisor there, but it was evolving to one where a person became armed or there was a crisis, and then it kind of transitioned to where a supervisor should be there. And it's going to work in tandem that officers, supervisors will be listening on the air, in addition to our communications where we receive dispatch, between the two of them trying to help each other out to make sure that we have the proper supervisory response. An additional part in there is continued mentorship. A significant number of officers involved in the shootings had 6 years or less. This is not a surprise given that a vast majority of our younger officers work in Field Services Bureau, and they also work the night shift. But what we did want to do is, and so just keep in mind that each of these officers do attend the academy, and we have a very lengthy field training process, but we wanted to take that a step further and start guiding them with the benefit of experienced officers. So we're evaluating, our younger officers, their first year on the job, they're called patrolman second classes. And we want to make sure that they're not sent to the calls together. So 2 P2Cs is what they're called together. We want to take a look and see if we can add an experienced officer with them to kind of help with the decision making and growth as they move through their career. And we already do limit the number of P2Cs bidding in the same unit every year. The next one is additional equipment for officers. There's 2 components that we came up with this one. One of them is the ballistic shield, and the other one is magnifying optics on rifles. There's 2 benefits there's a benefit to each one of these. The shield, when we have a critical incident, that can protect officers as they're trying to maneuver, depending on where they're at in the call for service, when someone is armed or actively shooting. And the second one is ballistic optics on the rifles, and this is for long distance, to keep our officers from closing distance and where they can remain behind cover, so they can have a better opportunity to see what the person is armed with. So from a long distance, they can able to see if it's a firearm, if it's another type of weapon, or no weapon at all. Clearing scenes is our next one. We had at least one incident where the primary suspect was already taken into custody, but we remained on scene because there was other people still in the house. And this is a big one that we really need to evaluate closely. We want to make sure that we're measuring what the legal aspect of it is and the need to get into that house. A lot of times we do need to get in there for evidentiary value for the criminal investigation. So we're really taking a look at how we're going to do this. The working group has been working significantly over the last couple of months on this one to determine the best course of action when this kind of incident occurs. And lastly is wound care. We did identify that there was a couple of issues where our officers really did need to render aid sooner than they did or at all. And so we wanted to make sure that we emphasize that during training. We do include that in academy training overall, and we will emphasize that in this 2023 use of force training that they are to render aid based off of the training that they receive. So in conclusion, those are the 7 considerations that we are looking at, and we will continue to do this every 6 months, looking at the previous 6 months of officer-involved shootings. And I will defer to Chief Medina for any follow-up comments.
And I think it's important that we recognize that this was to help improve the department. This wasn't about us re-looking and redisciplining officers. This wasn't about us placing blame on officers. This was about looking at us as an organization and seeing how we could be a much better organization and how we could have better outcomes. I think that it's also key for us to start developing these processes as we hope and work hard to get out of our consent decree with the Department of Justice and move forward. And The Albuquerque Police Department is going to have to figure stuff out on its own when DOJ leaves, and it's going to be a community expectation. And this is one of the first major steps we've done in making sure that we have a system in place that we're taking into consideration post a DOJ in Albuquerque and how we want to function as a police department. And with that, Gilbert, we'll take any questions. We'll run out the door.
I've got a question. There was the March 1st report where the external investigation, I think, had different findings than the internal affairs. Can you just explain, like, maybe how there could be, two different findings in situations like that, or like why the external affairs investigation found?
We have Zach Cottrell here, who oversees forced investigations, and he's greatly involved in the process, and we're going to let him give this the full response it needs, because he's probably the best one equipped to answer this. So, Zach?
So when the use of force is investigated, it's a dual investigation by our Force Division as well as EFIT right now, which is the External Force Investigation Team. When it goes to the last review period, it is reviewed by the commander in Force Division, along with EFIT's executive team as well. With that case that you're talking about, there was actually several roundtables held, meetings within Force and EFIT. As we went through that investigation, they were actually held weekly and then bi-weekly. When we got to the last decision, the executive team on Albuquerque Police Department felt that the force used was within our policy. Obviously, EFIT disagreed. They submitted a letter. That letter gets filed with the court, so it is with the judge now, with the DOJ and the stipulated order that established EFIT. As far as how that can happen, to your question, the 700 and I believe 25 cases or so that EFIT's been involved in so far, that's the first time that we've had a disagreement on the case. So I think that's a very rare occasion, obviously, but I think it can happen. Even though we're looking at the same evidence, I think there are different backgrounds in investigators, different experience that we may have that they may not have, and there's the experience they may have that we may not have. Ultimately, we don't want to come down to where there's a disagreement between us and EFIT, but it is going to happen every once in a great while. The process for that, when there is a disagreement, we actually have a superintendent of police reform now. That kind of stuff does go to him for review to ensure that if Albuquerque Police Department did miss something or misinterpreted something, that's addressed through a different venue, which is why the mayor created that position to begin with.
Awesome. And then in this situation, did EFIT give a reason or, claims as to why there was the disagreement, just in policies or?
So in their memo that they submitted, they felt that, kind of as Deputy Chief Lowe talked about, that there was a chance to use less lethal force earlier in that call. They felt that using that less lethal or that option earlier in the call made any decisions after that out of policy. Ultimately, we reviewed that and we disagreed. We disagreed that there was a deadly threat there. The appropriate response was made by the officers, and that's why there's a disagreement. Yeah.
And I think it's important that, you want to say something? I think it's important that there's several things we got to unwrap with this, and we got to make sure that we have an understanding. Is Zach talked about 700 cases where we've agreed, and the fact that we're held to a 95% compliance rate. And to me, I view it as not above 95%, 99.97% of the time we have been in agreement with EFIT. And one case should not impact compliance ratings, and it should not impact the relationship with the Department of Justice because we're not held to 100% compliance level. I think it's important for us to recognize that. Number two, there is always an inherited danger when you have dual investigations. This is not the first time we see a disagreement when there's dual investigations. We have seen this over time when we had dual investigations with the CPOA in the past. And they come to a finding, and the Albuquerque Police Department came to a different finding. So it is not out of character that this is going to occur. And I think it's important that we talk about also the fact that this wasn't based off of the officer's use of force at the moment. It's based off of use of force prior, and that we shouldn't have got there. And I think there's a difference, and we have to take into account that, are we saying this is excessive force, which we're very concerned about at the moment it's happening, or are they saying that we allowed actions to continue? And I think those are just real distinct things that we need to be well aware of and take into consideration when we look at that disagreement.
Let me just add, we do have our lawyers, city lawyers are working with the IPRA unit to determine that memo and other investigative documents, what can be released. So as soon as that's done, we'll release that information. The other thing too is the deadly force and all of those. I just want to remind everyone, we had a use of force demonstration last week that DC Low led with our training academy. So, you know, as we pointed out at that thing, some of you guys were there, you know, the vast majority, use of force is only used, you know, maybe sometimes more, sometimes less than 1% of the time. Deadly force is much less than that. So just keep all of that in mind as well.
You know, the last thing I'll touch on is, remember that after this incident, we did finalize a change in of our use of force policy that clarifies when less lethal. And during the original press conference, we spoke about it, the fact that we want to increase our abilities and clarify less lethal usage for our officers. So I think that there's a lot of things that have already been done to show and to explain why there could possibly be a non-concurrence on this case. Yes, sir.
The CPOA coming and going in disarray, how can the city of Albuquerque citizens and people get sort of answers with cases like this, or if they feel like they've have use of force on them and there's not really an outside entity to review that?
You know, I think that's a great question, and I think we got to remember that we are still being monitored, and whatever product we have will still go to the Department of Justice as a whole, and that their monitoring team is looking at these to see what a finding is on how APD has handled a situation. And I know that there has been some questions reference CPOA, and I think it's important that the citizens of Albuquerque recognize that the Albuquerque Police Department does not control the CPOA, and that it'd be inappropriate for me to comment on the functions of the CPOA, and I think that's something that needs to be asked of City Council, because the CPOA is a function of the Albuquerque City Council. And I also recognize that we want to get out of this settlement agreement, and one of the things as we negotiate this going forward is, I think there does have to be a separation. I think the Albuquerque Police Department should answer for what it's responsible for, and other entities within the city should answer for what they're responsible for. And I would hate for the city of Albuquerque's police department to remain under a consent decree when it's met all the requirements and an outside entity that we're not in control of is holding us up.
Any other questions?
I have a couple.
Yes.
Chief, so correct me if I'm wrong, these 7 considerations are all based on these 18 OISs from last
Yes.
year. I've been here 8 years at this point now, and in my 8 years here, we've never had a compilation year-end OIS presser. So why now? Am I right to assume because you're trying to plan out when this DOJ ends what you want to have in place for the department?
You know, I think it's what we've learned. I think it's important for us to recognize that there have been lessons learned and that we are consistently evolving as a police department. And part of that evolutionary process and what we're learning through the Department of Justice is that we always have to be, and this was said earlier as I was a deputy chief and the department didn't do it, but Dr. Ginger stated that we should always be looking to see how we could close the loop and how we could make sure that situations don't occur. And it was something, quite frankly, that was overlooked in a lot of ways, that this would be a beneficial thing for the Albuquerque Police Department to do. And we're not just going to do it on this. I think there are a lot of different ways that we should do this. I could think of a number of situations where we should be working to see how we correct problems and how we stop trends that are occurring. And one of the examples I'll use is, you know, we continue to tighten ourselves and our accountability, and commanders review overtime. Every period of time over the course of a year, commanders are now receiving who their top overtime earners are, and we're looking. So there's a lot of different places that us reviewing our processes and seeing how we could improve our shortcomings or areas where we could do better. It should be taken into consideration.
Can I add something on that?
Yes.
real quick?
Sure.
So the other thing with that is that there was public concern last year when we reached that level of OISs, and that we heard those concerns. It came up with the court on the consent decree. Some individuals expressed concerns about the sheer number. So even though we do all these thorough investigation of each incident, I think the chief and others decided that, you know, maybe we should take a look at all of them together and see if there's something else we could identify. So, you know, that was something that we took on. Chief decided to repeat this every 6 months so that we continued to approach it this way.
You know, and homicide actually does this now also. That's another area. The homicide unit has peer reviews. They have review periods built into their cases. We've also seen it be successful there. So this is about taking a look in the mirror and seeing how we could be better.
And then out of the trends in here, I know one big one was officers under 6 years of experience getting into OASs. What other main trends did you see?
Corey, you want to probably the best one to talk about that?
As far as officers, those were the main ones. We did experience 44% of those were individuals discharging a firearm at the time of the OIS at officers. I think that is one of the bigger ones that we're looking at, which is where the magnifying optics and the ballistic shield came from. Really, I mean, you'll see some in here, and I'm more than happy to answer any other major questions that you have. I'm trying to see if there's a couple of others in here that kind of stuck out to me this morning as I started reviewing this again. Another one was the identification of individuals in crisis. I think there was an assumption that we really knew that most of them were in crisis and that we knew them. Where in fact 6 of them had individuals that were had a history of crisis intervention, but 3 of them were only known by officers. So that's a big difference of what the officers actually know at the time of the shooting or the time of the interaction. I think that one kind of sticks out because it's very common that we get asked how many did we have ECIT, which is our enhanced crisis intervention officers on scene, and we did have the majority of those calls for service did have an ECIT. So it's just kind of showing that we are deploying the proper personnel to these types of calls for service.
You know, and I think one trend that when we talked about OISs last year and Gilbert gave the overview, I think Deputy Chief Lowe brings up a real important fact is, you know, I think it was somewhere near 80% of our officer-involved shootings, the individual that we were interacting with was armed with a firearm. And if you look back historically, it hasn't always been that way. And I think that, you know, the vast majority were armed also with a weapon in some way. And looking back historically as to why DOJ came here, that wasn't always the case. So I think that although we had an increase, we are seeing different behaviors and trends with the individuals that we're dealing with. And I think that's something that we need to consider as a community is like, how are we going to change this culture? We've seen an increase in homicides over the years. We've seen an increase in violence over in a lot of specific categories. While some of our numbers go down as a whole, we do see more individuals armed with firearms. We are having more interactions. And the one thing that is lacking from all this is all the successful stories of when our officers do a wonderful job, de-escalate a situation, and take an armed individual into custody. And sometimes that's overseen and it's not recognized. But our officers each day risk their lives, have encounters with armed individuals, and we have a fabulous outcome. But it's unfortunate that that's not always recognized, and that's not always what's going to grab the lead story in any media outlet.
Then why not share that?
Do you want to mention the award you're doing now?
Yes, we do. We do recognize our officers for their work individually. Each month we created new categories, and one of them is the De-Escalation of the Month Award. And yeah, that's something we should take into consideration, and we should look to see how we could put out more information. There's times we share it, but there becomes a time when the amount of resources and the amount of time, and one of the things we have to improve on is the internal communication and making sure that we're getting these stories and we're putting them out also. But I hope that they're also grasped by the community and the media to showcase the great work that our officers do each and every day. Yes, ma'am.
Do you guys keep track of the time someone shoots at an officer and like isn't, because I've read complaints where someone shoots at an officer and they get detained and don't get shot. Do you keep track of those metrics of like when someone either shoots at an officer or like shows some kind of lethal force towards an officer and like gets arrested, doesn't get shot, there isn't an OIS incident?
That's something we could greatly, number one, improve on, and number two, get out to the public. Because there is, I can think of auto theft cases in the near past, in the recent near past, where we've had individuals discharge their firearms and officers didn't discharge back. So, we will take that back and we will look to see how we could capture this better and how we could bring these out to the community, these examples, and showcase the great work that's done.
Chief, how does 18 OISs compare in 2022 to years past?
It was a record. It was double what we typically saw in the past. And that, like Gilbert stated, that is a great community concern and why we're here today being as transparent as possible and looking to see how we could make changes that lower that.
We have numbers going back to like 2016, I think, that we're like pretty certain of. Do you know, is it a record like as of all time or as far as?
It's a record of all time that we're aware of. I don't know another time frame when it was more.
Fatal too, like 10 fatal. Do you?
I don't think fatal is a record, but we'd have to research that a little bit more.
Is a record.
18 discharges of firearms is a record. Any other
We're also
questions?
going to start posting those online, not just the list of all the OISs, but also the press releases that went with them, the DA letters that were produced, and then in some of the cases where CPOA produced a letter. So if anyone wants to look them up and look up the context in the case, they could do that with case numbers.
Okay. Now, I don't know if you answered this. So will we be doing a year-end review every year?
We will be doing a review of, my goal is to do it every 6 months.
Okay.
Is that bi-yearly we do a review so that we catch these trends quicker than we did last year. I mean, it's great we started it last year, but in retrospect, I wish we would have done it 6 months earlier.
Okay, and would that be a 6 month, like we do this and like reporters would come and like get like a pamphlet on the, or you mean?
I'm totally open to it. I think that this is big enough an issue, and as long as I'm chief, I intend that we should have these discussions and we should get this word out to the community.
Chief, for background, can you explain how the department came up with these 7 considerations? Like, who's the team behind it? Who looks at what? Just a little background.
The background was this, is I approached Deputy Chief Lowe and I asked her to head this. I purposely did not want to be in the room. I wanted recommendations to come towards myself and the Superintendent of Police Reform, because I know that too many times the chief is in the room and whatever the chief says, a lot of times people just say yes. So I wanted this to be a peer review amongst deputy chiefs and the highest ranks of this department so that there would be free conversation and so that we would get an unsolicited evaluation from everybody in the room. And I'll let Corey maybe talk a little bit about what the meetings looked like and how they came upon the results that you're reading today.
That's a good question as far as who we had involved in the room. So it had myself as the Accountability Bureau. So I have the not only thing for everything DOJ, but I also have the Training Academy. So we have the academy perspective. We had Deputy Director Zach Cottrell. He's over IFD and IEPS, both internal affairs divisions. So we were able to have that force background. One of his commanders, Scott Norris, who's over IFD, so the investigations of those force. We had Deputy Chief Josh Brown, who oversees the Field Services Bureau. Deputy Chief Cecily Barker, who's over the Criminal Investigations Bureau. So the reason she's in there is, one, she has non-uniformed officers and detectives working in her bureau, but she also has the multi-agency task force who is part of the criminal investigations for officer-involved shootings. And we also had a Deputy Director, Jimmy Collins, who is part of the disciplinary process. We just wanted to be able to see if we can get, if there was any names that came up or any circumstances that we needed to address from all angles. And then we also had one of our legal advisors. So that made up the group. We met on multiple occasions. It was a round table right around here. We brought things up on the screen. We talked about each individual case, starting from the CAD, which is the computer-aided dispatch, where it just shows the call for service. We reviewed the reports, watched the the OBRDs or on-body recording devices, and looked at the FRB reports if it had gone to FRB. And we went case by case, and we tried to figure out what was similar between all of them, what they had in common, and what trends that we saw from each of our individual aspects. And then we had to try to bring it down and say, okay, what exactly is important for this particular topic, and then also not to overextend ourselves and come up with like 15 things that just we weren't going to be able to handle over time. But these were the biggest priorities for this go round, and we had some other ancillary ones outside of it that just didn't really impact the officer-involved shooting itself, but I think that was important for the department as a whole.
How many months did this take for you guys to come up with these considerations?
2 months. So January, about mid-January was our first one, and then we ended it obviously at the end of March.
How often did you guys meet?
We met in person 3 times, but we had a lot of discussions, kind of going through one another, just because I was heading it up, and when we started putting it together, there was just a couple of gaps in there, so there was a lot of telephonic conversations as well.
I want to talk to you also. The other part of it too is the chief's been to pretty much every scene, and I think DC Brown's been to every scene too. So it was, I think, a good idea to get others who aren't always at the scene to get that perspective. So it was a unique perspective.
And I think it is important, and I think it's important on a variety of reasons. Every time I've been in town, I've been at an officer-involved shooting, and I've given the media on it, because I think it's important at a number of levels. Is number one, the chief should be engaged from the very beginning. I think the community needs to see that. I think officers need to see that. I think it's good for the morale of the officers, and it's good that the community knows that the chief of police himself is taking these serious. I knew these were serious from the very, very beginning of me returning back to Albuquerque, that officer-involved shootings were going to be in the forefront. And I think that as we continue to go to scenes and we see what's occurring from the very beginning, it starts giving us insight into things that we want to see done. Because I will tell you, it's been over the past few years that we wanted to see more active involvement with supervision. And we had already added more supervision and more supervisor input to some of these these incidents, because of things that we had seen from the initial time of these initial briefings on these officer-involved shootings. But it's also helped us become better. I want us to rewind to 2018 when I returned. It used to take us a very long time to announce that we had an officer-involved shooting. And I can tell you, myself and Gilbert were driving to the Eubank shooting, and I was a deputy chief, when I looked at Gilbert, and Gilbert looked at me and said, "What are we waiting for?" And it is the number one move we made with the media. There's no more questions. Is this an OIS? We're never going to change that. The moment we have the information that this is an OIS, we are releasing that information. It was the officer-involved shooting that I was on scene of as a deputy chief at Ouray and Coors, involving some of our investigative units. The first time where we had to push back on our investigators and say, is there a gun on scene? And that's when we started releasing information. You go back and you look, that is the first time we released information. So being there is key to leadership in us being able to evolve and to be more transparent with the community. Because we had to fight tradition and what was the way we've always done it with some of our own people at the time to get to the point where we've evolved today with officer-involved shootings. And I thank Gilbert. He's been at every single officer-involved shooting. It's not like me and Josh are the two that show up. Deputy Chief Barker shows up. The duty chiefs usually show up. So I think it's important that leadership be out there, and that it's for a variety of reasons, from community to officers, and how we manage the police department.
And Chief, how long have you been in law enforcement for?
1995.
Since 1995.
Yes.
How many OASs have you been involved in?
Me, personally, one, where I was the primary individual who discharged the firearm.
What is it now, looking back upon it now and getting all these changes, what does it mean to you to make these changes to the department since you've been involved in an OAS?
You know, I think that the number one thing I would say is that departments do a much better job caring for their employees. During my OIS, it was very tough OIS. That still today, this day, and I'll try not to get emotional, because the last time I spoke about it, I did with the media. But it is very difficult for an officer to go through this. And I sat in a car with the behavioral sciences for 5 minutes before I left the scene. And I had a 5-minute conversation with behavioral sciences before I returned back to work. And there are things that I'm grateful for my family's support, that I didn't go down those paths, but there were difficult times. And I think we do a much better job in caring for our officers and making sure they're getting the resources they need, because the one thing that is forgotten in all these officer-involved shootings is that the officers are affected also. That it will leave something in their mind and in their heart for the rest of their lives. And I think that's the one thing we've done better as a department, is care for our officers and recognize that this is a life-changing event for them also.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.